Hey, I'm Joey, and this is a quick devotional to help fill your newsfeed with more of Jesus. And Mark 1, 9 through 13 says this. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit of God descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. I find this passage rather confusing because I'm always curious as to why Jesus needs to get baptized. We need to get baptized because we're not Jesus, we're not perfect. But I think Jesus being baptized was a symbolic act for two reasons. It was symbolic because baptism is an image of the Spirit coming on to the believer, but also it's symbolic because Jesus is then being commissioned, in a sense, for his formal ministry of bringing the kingdom of God. Because at this point in history, Jesus is probably about 30 to 33 years old, somewhere in there. So he's already lived a long time. And he's probably lived a very ordinary life. But at this moment, Jesus' formal ministry begins through this baptism. And God calls down from heaven and says that he is well pleased and loves his Son. Basically, God is giving his stamp of approval over what is actually happening. And then the Spirit of God brings Jesus out from this river and into the desert to be tempted by Satan for 40 days. And that's a bit confusing. Why would the Spirit do this? What is interesting about Jesus' life is his entire life, in a sense, parallels the highest points of the nation of Israel's history. So throughout the Old Testament, Israel had moments of obedience, but also moments of disobedience. A lot of moments of disobedience. And what we find throughout the Gospels, and even in Mark, is that Jesus takes these moments of Israel's historic disobedience, and he redeems them, and he fulfills them in his person. So the nation of Israel had wandered for 40 years in the desert, and they were tempted to not go into the promised land, and they gave into that temptation, and that's why they had to wander for 40 years in the desert. And Jesus being drawn by the Spirit into the desert and being tempted by Satan, and him eventually coming out of the desert, not being overcome by the temptation of Satan, shows that Jesus is actually the true Israel. He has redeemed the situation that happened in the Old Testament, and he's going to bring forward and bring in and usher in God's kingdom through himself.